Hey everyone, today we're going to pick up where we left off last Wednesday. So if you recall, we were talking about language models, primarily language models based on the transformer architecture. And there were quite a lot of them. And so we're going to pick up where we left off and talk about models intended for long text. And then I'll kind of have a recap, which tries to sum up the themes, kind of what we learned by going through these different models, and say a little bit about what you may actually want to use in practice. Okay, so if you're going to process a sequence of n tokens, that requires n squared attention calculations for each attention head during the first pass. And so obviously that's going to put a constraint on a sequence length that you can process. And so Bert addresses this by enforcing a hard limit of 512 tokens in each sequence. And that's more than enough to process the overwhelming majority of sequences, and at least in most of the benchmark data sets. However, it's not sufficient if you need to attend within longer texts, like entire documents. Okay. And so the basic idea of long former is to use an attention sliding window of size W. And this allows a multi-layer transformer model to have a receptive field that covers the entire document. And so to understand kind of what this is doing and why it may work, think back to when we talked about receptive fields within CNNs, right? And so if initially our receptive field was like a 3x3 convolution, kind of as we move deeper and deeper into the network, it had a wider and wider receptive field, because then that 3x3 convolution combines information from that 3x3 window, and then that's passed on to the next layer. And that cell has information from the surrounding cells, and now you're doing, and so do all of its surrounding cells, and you do another convolution on that. And so as you kind of move into the network, your receptive field increases, and this is exactly the same intuition here. And so we saw that transformer models have varying depths. In the extreme, GPT-3 has something like 96 layers, but at least something like 12. And so as you move into the network, you can start initially by looking at this kind of sliding window around each of the tokens, but you get an increasing receptive field as you move further into the network. And so this is just a picture illustrating that. And so full attention would look like panel A, which is n squared. And so we know we can't really do that on sequences that are too long. Panel B just shows kind of vanilla sliding window attention. Long former also experiments with dilated sliding window attention for an even larger receptive field. And if you remember, there's these class tokens, which aggregate the entire sentence into a single representation to allow for classification. And so it might be kind of a bit odd, to have a sliding window with that. In principle, it could attend to different things to the receptive field as well. But what long former does in practice is to have like global attention for these class tokens, but then sliding window attention for the other token. And so the global attention is symmetric in that like the class token can attend to every other token in the sequence, and every token in the sequence can attend to the class tokens. And so this is what it does in practice in order to be able to have much longer sequences than 512 tokens that are actually computationally feasible to compute attention for. So that's long former. And there's also like a recent model, which seems to beat out Big Bird on some of the long sequence tasks. So this model is called Big Bird. It's a recent innovation by Google. It has a similar intuition to long former, but just they kind of tweak it in a way that seems to do a bit better. So again, if we want to attend through long text, we can't have exponential like global attention. Big Bird is able to produce sequences that are 8 times longer than Bert because it comes up with a formulation for attention that's just linear in complexity. And so what it does is to combine several different types of attention. And so there's the window attention and the global attention for certain tokens, just like in long former, but it also combines this with random attention. Okay, so that's the basic idea. I don't want to go into kind of too much detail. I would say that kind of the more fundamental issue, if you're working with like documents or like long sequence text, it can be almost kind of like a just in terms of defining the question well, it seems harder, right? Because let's say you have single sentences and you want to classify their sentiment, and we'll talk about sentiment classification later today. You know, usually within a given sentence or headline or whatever, it's going to have a single sentiment or a single topic. So you're trying to classify the topics of different sentences. But if you have an entire document, it may just be like a less well-defined kind of problem. Does that overall document kind of have a strong sentiment? You know, is it buried in a lot of other things? You know, does it talk about a single topic or is it talking about a bunch of stuff? If you're kind of working with longer documents, you have to think about what the appropriate unit of analysis is. Is it like the whole document, or do you want to process paragraphs? And the document stuff, just I would say like for longer documents, it's just not super well explored because there's kind of less labeled data out there. Kind of a lot of the benchmark tasks that we tend to think about correspond to shorter text. And so if you get into kind of the realm of embedding, like trying to create an embedding for an entire document, that's just kind of less well-trodden territory. Okay, are there any questions about long former or about Big Bird? Okay, and so I know like basically, well, you can kind of see on the slide here, we went through a lot of different models. And I would just like to like talk for a minute about like what are the main themes that emerge from this discussion? Like what are the biggest things that you really need to take away from this? And then if you kind of are just starting out and you want to do something with NLP, where should you start in terms of this long list of models? And so first of all, you've seen that transformers have come to completely dominate language modeling. Why is that? Well, there's 2 reasons really for their success. So self-attention removes locality bias, like by design, and LSTM pays the most attention to the closest context. And that's like a feature of LSTM. It was kind of built on the intuition that those close contexts matter the most, and we know that it's difficult to have long run dependencies in an LSTM because of vanishing gradients. When you look at the transformer and the way attention works, as long as it's within that sequence length that you're able to have, so say it's as long as it appears, you know, within that 512 token window and Bert, or longer if you're using something like Big Bird, there's equal opportunity to attend to that. And so it just gives you kind of like a more flexible way to attend to text, which is good for performance. And then the other thing that's like super important is that the entire input can be processed in parallel, whereas an LSTM requires sequential processing. And this just makes a massive difference because it allows us to harness the parallel computing power of GPUs, which allow for massively larger models to be trained and to be run. And, you know, as we have seen, another key theme from this literature is just that bigger is better. Like if there's one thing that comes out of it, it's probably that. And we could never have like an LSTM model that begins to kind of rival the size of T5 or something, because you can't leverage like parallel compute with an LSTM. And so, yeah, one of the clearest lessons to emerge is that bigger models trained on more data for longer are the ones that achieve state of the art, and they do that on a wide variety of downstream tasks. And amazingly, these performance gains have not yet kind of asymptoted out, even when looking at very large models. And so if you go to T5 that has 11 billion parameters, and yet you still kind of see this increase in performance on downstream tasks that comes with model size. And this is true even when you look at downstream tasks that involve fine tuning on small data sets. And so this is a picture from Bert, but you know, now the models go out to way more than 300 million parameters. You might have thought when this picture was made that it was going to level out, but it kind of essentially is still going up. And so as your parameters, your transforming parameters increase, your accuracy tends to increase, which is really remarkable, like the degree to which these architectures have been able to solve like overfitting and vanishing gradient problems, which you might have thought ex ante that this is never going to be like possible, that either just like a model that large is going to be completely unwieldy, you'll have optimization problems, overfitting, but essentially like all the things we've seen throughout the course, you know, have essentially solved those problems, and you can just have these enormous models, and they are the ones that do the best. Okay, and so on this theme, T5, the paper did a bunch of ablation studies to understand which features matter. So they looked at things like model size, amount of training data, the domain of the training data, or the amount of noise in training data, the pre-training objectives, different types of ensembling, various details of the fine-tuning, multitask training. So essentially at all these kind of details that go into like the sauce of how you make a language model. And essentially what they found is that the only thing that really matters were model size and amount of training data. And so, you know, for example, like we saw that with the masked tokens, it's like 15% of tokens in Bert get masked. And of those, like 80% are masked, you know, 10% are get replaced with the wrong thing, and 5% stay the same or something like that. Like that doesn't matter. Like, you know, a lot of details like that, they don't really seem to matter too much. But what really helps you is to have a bigger model trained on more data for longer. And so the best model that the T5 paper studies is the 11 billion parameter one, that compares to Bert large, which has 330 million parameters. So it's like way bigger. It's trained on 120 billion words of cleaned common crawl text. If you look, you might say, well, what about Albert? Like we talked about Albert, about how it utilized parameter sharing across layers to cut down on the number of parameters, or kind of at the very least, it had like the Albert extra large beat Bert by essentially heavily sharing parameters across layers, but increasing substantially the size of the hidden state representations. And so it's true that Albert is lighter weight in terms of parameters, but the version of Albert that beat Bert took like several times longer to pre-train. And so this is a paper, this is a table from the Albert paper, and you can see it's like the extra large. It did really well. It has 255 million parameters relative to 334 from Bert large, but it actually takes more than 3 times longer to train. And so being light in terms of parameters is still going to be beneficial for you if you need to use it, you know, deploy it on your local machine to do inference, or, you know, potentially to do fine tuning, but it's not that, like, you know, as we saw, Bert was actually undertrained. So it's like nobody's found kind of a way around the fact that you make a bigger model you train it on more data for longer, that's what's going to let you achieve state of the art. And that's why all these papers, they come out of like Microsoft or Facebook AI research or Google, because those are the people that have access to this kind of compute. And so if you go back to before, the past few years, it was common to design customized architectures for different types of downstream language tasks. And these could be highly specialized to particular tasks. And so you'd have like computational linguistic people, and they specialize in name entity recognition or part of speech tagging, dependency parsing or entailment. Like they specialize in these kind of specific tasks. And there were specialized model architectures for each of those tasks that tended to be the ones that achieved the state of the art. And this just got kind of obliterated by Bert and by other models that provided a way to fine tune most downstream tasks you want to do within the architecture of the language model. And some other models had the same idea, but this really took off with Bert. And that's part of the reason why Bert has been like so enormously influential. And so it really underscores like your performance on downstream tasks is about having good representations from the language model. And you achieve those good representations through training massive models on massive data. And it's not really about like having human engineered domain knowledge at all. And so this is just, the figure from Bert, and you see that like how it's, for different tasks. And so if you want to do sentence classification tasks, so that could be sentiment analysis or topic analysis or, whatever you want to use for classification, you just fine tune Bert by putting your labels on that class token. And we're going to talk about this more a little bit later today. So you just take Bert and you take your label data set for classification and you fine tune on that class token and that, achieve state of the art. So the first one, I guess, is sentence pairs. The second one is single sentence, which would be like the sentiment analysis. We're going to talk about sentence pairs is things like, are these two sentences contradictions or not, etc. There's a bunch of tasks for that. Question answering. Again, you just use the Bert architecture, but now you are, you have the start and end of where the answer to the question is in that paragraph, and you use that to fine tune it. Or if you want to do tagging, like part of speech tagging, again, you just take Bert and you have labeled data for the part of speech tags, and you just use that to fine tune Bert, and like that achieves state of the art. And so this is pretty kind of astounding. And I think maybe like, some people who were like in computational linguistics and they spent, kind of all this incredible domain knowledge, kind of engineering these models to do good at these tasks. And it's kind of like astounding that you have a model that people will say like, well, it's just like a pile of linear algebra. And it achieves these results. But I think it's like a little bit like, too simplistic to say that. As we saw, there were a lot of difficult challenges that people had to kind of solve to get these models to work. But it's just an amazingly kind of powerful framework that, and this single model, you can use it to do basically any task that you want downstream without having to design your own architecture downstream. You just take Bert and you go and you download it and you have some labels and you fine tune it. And that's it. You don't need like, to design your own thing. Same thing with T5, right? T5 was this framework where you have text to text. And again, like the model can be used to do all these different kinds of tasks. Okay, so the bottom line is that pre-trained language models work extremely well for doing downstream tasks compared to what we had before. And, oftentimes kind of more generally, at least for benchmark downstream tasks. And the main thing that makes them work better is building bigger models, trained for longer on more data. This is very expensive. We saw how like GPT-3 was something like $4.6 million to train. But fortunately for us, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft have a lot of resources and they have a business incentive to pre-train them. And, at least up to the present, mostly, they have open source their innovations, which is kind of amazing. You might have thought like, well, maybe Google will not want to keep this proprietary, so that, Bing has Bert-based search. You would think that maybe Google wouldn't have wanted that, but for whatever reason, they open source it. And, the exception is OpenAI, which is affiliated with Microsoft, and like things like GPT-3 haven't been open sourced. But by and large, at least to date, these pre-trained models have been open source and you can go download them. Maybe you can't handle like 11 billion parameters from T5 on your computer, but maybe like Albert works and it's there. And to that point, things like distillation, which we saw with DistillBert, or parameter sharing, make it possible to do inference and potentially fine tune on commercial hardware. So like when you use Google, it's not actually serving Bert, it's using like a Google distilled version of Bert for your search. And same thing, we've seen how these lighter weight models, they may be good enough for the inference you want to do. And this will be a kind of a theme that comes up again. And these models remove the need to design lots of customized architectures for downstream tasks. And that's a really good thing for us because ultimately we want to get our data and like answer an economic question with it. We don't want to have to spend, a massive amount of time understanding computational linguistics and how you engineer some system to pull out some kind of information. And basically you need to, to understand what's going on inside the model, you just need to understand linear algebra, multivariable calculus, and some, Python programming, and you're pretty much good to go. And so it works better, it makes our lives easier. Like that's pretty awesome. But okay, so where do you start? I showed you a bunch of models, and different models, they have different architectures, but they also had different training objectives and they were trained on different data. And papers maybe say something about the differences with other models, but it's far from comprehensive because it's really expensive to pre-train these models. And so you can't just like pre-train a whole bunch of different versions of Bert by changing different things around because that would cost a huge amount of compute. And so hence the influence of these different factors, which will matter probably differentially for your downstream tasks, is kind of conflated. But the good thing is you can experiment. So you could start by just doing experiments with the pre-trained embeddings and try to get a sense of which one seems to work for you. And we'll again kind of talk about how to use pre-trained embeddings directly for your downstream tasks a bit later today. So the first thing that I think it makes sense to ask is there a pre-trained version that approximates your task? So for example, there's a model called Bert Tweet. If you want to work with Twitter data, that's probably where you want to go. Because yeah, maybe Bert isn't state of the art for sentiment analysis and it's like Roberta that is, or T5, but Wikipedia doesn't look like tweets. Common Crawl doesn't really look like tweets. Bert Tweet was trained on tweets and it looks like what you want to process. So almost certainly it's going to be the best bet for doing something downstream with tweets. There's a Roberta News, and it was trained on the news corpus, and there's a lot of other things that kind of baseline Roberta was trained on. But if you're processing news, maybe you just want the version that's trained on news because it looks like what you want to do downstream. And so that's the first thing that you have to go and look for. And these are kind of well-publicized models. They don't exist for lots of very specific data, but for things like tweets or news, they're kind of out there. That aside, I think like, Albert, Roberta, or XLNet are good places to start. And Albert in particular seems to make a lot of sense. And so if you're really computationally constrained, you can use a lightweight Albert and that will come at a penalty. But it will run for you on your machine quickly. You can get a sense of if it works, or you can use the Albert extra large, which is actually doing pretty well. And it's not giving you like a huge number of parameter savings, but it does great. XLNet, as we talked about, it integrates kind of the dependencies across sequences. So if that seems important to your task, you might want to try that. If you have long texts, you'll be left with Big Bird. Probably want to use that, maybe long former. This literature moves fast, and so you have to kind of try to pay attention to it. But when new models get released, they get a lot of attention. I'm going to talk a little bit later today about a website called Papers with Codes, where you can just track like all the models on all the benchmarks that you want. So it's kind of straightforward to keep up if there's some big new model, like, and you're following this, you'll hear about it. And so that's kind of the general overview. It's hard to say for sure. look at whether there's a model that approximates your downstream tasks, or if not, I would just, maybe choose Albert or Roberta, maybe XLNet if dependencies seem important, but you can also take the pre-trained embeddings for them and just train a lightweight classifier on all of them and see what gives you the best performance, or if it doesn't really matter. Are there any questions about this? Okay, so in the rest of the time today, I'm going to talk about a couple, or really a few somewhat related topics. So I'll talk a little bit more about understanding transformers, like specifically understanding what's in a transformer embedding. I'll talk briefly about visualization, and then I'll talk about sentiment analysis, which is a downstream task that you may want to pursue. And the language models that we just saw make doing sentiment analysis, first of all, feasible, and second of all, straightforward. And so sometimes you'll see like there's this view that economists have, like they tried like 10 years ago or something to do like sentiment analysis using n-grams, and it didn't work for the reasons that we saw when we talked about n-grams. Like they have kind of just like a very simplistic kind of sense of like, oh, I'm just using dictionaries of whether words are positive or negative, and trying to use that to do sentiment analysis, and think like, oh, it's not going to work. But actually, kind of with modern methods, there's been a huge amount of research on sentiment analysis, and I think it can work relatively well. Okay. And so first of all, like, is a question that you might have had based on the last couple of lectures is, what does Bert attend to? So there is a literature that seeks to understand the inner workings of transformer-based language models. And in particular, I want to mention this paper by Clark et al. The lead author is this guy, Christopher Manning at Stanford, who's actually done a lot of papers trying to understand what Bert is doing. So he's a good reference to know about. And so they look at pre-trained Bert, and importantly, they're not looking at a version of Bert that's been fine-tuned on any downstream task. They're looking at the version of Bert that's just been pre-trained with the masking, the unsupervised pre-training. Okay, so the model's only seen self-supervised training. And the bottom line is that when you look at Bert's attention heads, they attend to different linguistic phenomenon like very well, despite not having been trained to do that. So they're just trained to predict the mass tokens. But here's from that paper, you see attention head 1-1 is attending very broadly. 3-1 is, each of those is attending to the next token. 3-7, that's 8-7, so the 7th head and the 8th layer is attending to the separator tokens. The 6th head and the 11th layer is attending to periods in the sentence. And they have just a ton of examples. So as this is the 10th head and the 8th layer, objects are attending to their verbs. If you look at the 11th head and the 8th layer, noun modifiers attend to their noun, which is, and again, it wasn't trained to do that. It was just trained to predict the mass tokens. Okay, the 6th head and the 7th layer, possessive pronouns and apostrophes attend to the head of their corresponding noun particle. The 10th head of the 4th layer, passive auxiliary verbs attend to the verb that they modify. And so basically like all this grammar stuff, like it's in there being attended to, and people didn't have to engineer it to do it. And it's not trained to like recognize parts of speech or anything. It's just trained to figure out what the mass token is. And it turns out, you need to attend to all these like grammatical things to be able to figure that out. Here's another one, passive auxiliary verbs attend to the verb that they modify. And so you could go on about this. So it makes a lot of sense. We know that it's doing super well, and it's just like learning to do all of this from a massive amount of data and learning that very well. But this raises the question of like, what's in an embedding? And so, presumably we've seen it attending to all these like syntax type relationships, and those should be in an embedding. But how do we figure out like what these embeddings or these hidden representations from transformer-based models. What sort of information do they contain? And so the way that people have thought about this is by using what are called probing classifiers. And so the basic idea is that you try to predict certain things about words or about sentences using just their pre-trained embedding. So again, you haven't fine-tuned on a model that does this downstream. You just want to see kind of if the pre-trained embeddings know this stuff. So you might have a classifier that classifies for each word the part of speech, or the tense, or the gender of that word, or the word senses based on context. And so you look at whether the same words, but they have different meanings because they're in different contexts, like how far apart are their embedding vectors. You know, essentially anything that you just train a classifier on and then it can correctly classify that in a high share of cases, then we know that that information is in these embeddings, which, you know, in Bert large, each embedding is a 1024 dimensional vector. And so a recent survey paper aggregates the findings of many different probing classifier studies of Bert. And essentially the bottom line from that study is that Bert embeddings contain information on a lot of stuff. You know, from like the context, the syntax, kind of all of that. If Bert embeddings can produce a coherent classifier, they provide information on that feature. Another thing that people have asked is we know that there's different transformer layers. So maybe 12 or 20 or even more different transformer blocks that get stacked on top of each other. And you can also probe what's contained in hidden representations from the different layers of Bert. And so there's some evidence that that sentiment evaluation, which we're going to talk about later, peaks with the later layers, although this appears to be kind of not that well studied. More generally, representations of the same word in different contexts move apart. So their cosine similarity and they get further apart as you move deeper into the network. And what this suggests is that the upper layers present more context-specific representations, like which makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of consistent with the idea that something like sentiment evaluation, which is probably going to be dependent on the context, that those upper layer hidden representations, like further into the network, are going to be more informative about that. Another question is what happens to Bert embeddings if you fine tune the model? So there's a paper on this by Merchant et al. That suggests that fine tuning mostly alters the top few layers, and fine tuning has a significant effect on in-domain sentences, but things that are out of domain from fine tuning remain much closer to the original representations, which again, this kind of makes a lot of sense. And so if you say like, well, Roberta's trained on like, you know, 160 gigs of text, like, and you know, how large is your labeled data set really? Like it makes sense that you're tweaking the features that are important to that. That's like hence the term fine tuning, important to the task you want to do. And it's going to mostly do that in these upper layers where the kind of more task specific information lives, this suggests, and really is only going to change parts of the text that are relevant kind of to the labeled data that you have. And so the stuff kind of the base layers are doing kind of maybe more basic or less context dependent stuff compared to those top layers, which are moving when you fine tune. Is there any question about this at all? Okay, so I want to say a word about visualizing embeddings. And so embeddings are these dense, like very dense high dimensional objects. So if you're using Bert base, the hidden states are 768 dimensions, and there are 1024 dimensions for Bert large. And so obviously you can't really make sense of these kind of points that are in just super high dimensional space. And so there are two main approaches to distilling relevant information from an embedding. So the first is dimensionality reduction. So you find a way to project that high dimensional space down into a low dimensional space that preserves relevant features of the space. And then the other thing is distillation via function, which is using a classifier or some other function to extract the relevant information. And this is like what sentiment analysis does. And so we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but more generally, you can use functions to kind of reduce and distill the information you want. Okay, and so for dimensionality reductions, there's three main approaches. So PCA, TSME or TSME, and UMAP. UMAP is state of the art. You probably should not be using PCA for reasons that we're about to discuss. So what PCA does, principal components analysis, is to find the orthogonal bases or axes that maximize the variance of the data and then projects the data onto those axes. So the first principal component is the direction of the greatest variance in the data. And the reason you don't want to do this is it's not optimized for preserving either local or global structure of a set of high dimensional points, which is kind of what you want to do when you're visualizing things. You want to preserve that local structure and ideally preserve some of the global structure. So usually this isn't going to provide satisfactory results. TSME stands for T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, and it creates probability distributions over neighboring points in a high dimensional space. And the high probabilities in these distributions correspond to closer points in the space, and then tries to recreate the distributions for these points in a much lower space. So say in a 2 to 3 dimensional space. And it's good at preserving local structures, but not very good at preserving global structures. So what that means is it can separate out distinct clusters in the data, but distances between them but distances between those clusters aren't necessarily going to be very meaningful because it's really optimized to preserve that local structure and not to really pay attention to the global structure. And so this is a visualization I think we saw kind of earlier. On the right, you see the PCA dimensionality reduction, and on the left is the TSME, and you can see that the latter just does a much better job of preserving the high dimensional clusters that are present. And the clusters that are present in the high dimensional data, it's able to preserve those when you project it down to 2 dimensions, whereas PCA doesn't, do that. And then the final thing is an approach called UMAP, which is essentially state of the art. We don't really have time to get into the details of it because it's fairly involved, but sort of roughly speaking, the method creates a manifold in high dimensional space that has good properties, and it creates a similar manifold in low dimensional space, and then it maximizes their similarity using cross entropy loss. And I think there's a video about it on the syllabus if you want to understand kind of exactly how this works. But there's code to implement this. This is probably what you want to do if you want to visualize your embeddings. And it preserves local structure well, but it does a better job than TSME with global structure. And so that's why it's generally become preferred in recent years as the method to use for dimensionality reduction to visualize embeddings. Okay. Another thing that you see some in the literature is this idea of probing classifiers, and the fact that they can potentially be used for visualization. So specifically, there's like this thing called the HewittManning methodology. So the same Manning we were talking about and what does Bert attend to. And they estimate a matrix that can push Bert embeddings into a low dimensional space where the distance between the projected embeddings corresponds to the distance between words in a syntax tree. And so maybe this isn't like a task that we really care about, but other people have used this method with other objectives. So for example, word sense disambiguations. They use major Cs to take these high dimensional points into lower dimensional space where the objective is to make different words that have the same meanings be close and same word that have different meanings be further away. And they potentially change the size of the matrices to successfully squeeze the embeddings into lower and lower dimensions. And so this is like a more structured approach that depends on some of these kind of structured things, like the syntax tree, which was a very common kind of tool in in computational linguistics historically. But the basic idea is that, you can potentially use essentially like matrix multiplication to push your embeddings down to lower dimensional space, but do that in a more structured way to achieve like a particular objective. Okay. Any questions about visualization? Okay. So finally, I want to talk about sentiment analysis, which I suspect is a task that some of you guys are interested in. And so this already came up earlier, but essentially modern language modeling makes it very straightforward to conduct a sentiment analysis. So for example, in Bert, you just fine tune the classifier on the class token. So remember that like before a sequence in Bert, we have that class token to tell the model that a sequence is starting. And what you can do is just you have some labeled data, like this is positive, this is negative. And you just, in addition to kind of, having the masking, you're fine tuning the model on that labeled data that gives the sentiment. And that's it. And you fine tune Bert, and that will produce hopefully, good representations, and you use the output of that class head for your, your research. And so the biggest challenge with this is just assembling labeled data to train the model. So let's say that you have headlines and you want to classify whether or not they have hyperpartisan sentiment or not. And you can easily kind of do that in a technical sense from within Bert. You just take your hyperpartisan labels and you feed headlines into Bert, and you fine tune the model to do a good job of matching the labeled data essentially. And the challenge is this is that you just have to have labeled data to tell the model kind of what it means to be hyperpartisan or not. And so we'll talk later in the course about zero-shot classification, but probably odds are that you're still going to need some sort of labeled data to achieve desired accuracy. You can't do kind of everything in an unsupervised sort of approach usually and get the accuracy you want. And so one kind of middle of the road approach that can work well for this sort of task is to fine tune on a large and somewhat related or noisier pre-existing data set, and then fine tune on a smaller data set that's been more carefully curated. And it's smaller because it was more expensive to collect. So going back to the hyperpartisan example, you could say that like, well, for a first pass, I'm going to say that every headline from, the Fox News website and from the Washington Post is hyperpartisan. And I'm going to take some, PBS or like NPR, and I'm going to say that stuff is not hyperpartisan. And I'll use that. And we know those labels aren't perfect. Like we know that there's problems with that, but it contains kind of some information. And so you use that, and you have like a large data set because you can just automatically collect that. Hundreds of thousands of those, and you use that to fine tune. And then you have a more carefully constructed hyperpartisan data set that you've constructed yourself, and you're sure that it gets accurate, but it's really expensive to do that yourself. So it's a small data set, and you use that small data set to fine tune. And this kind of approach is pretty common. And you can imagine using it in a variety of ways where you have kind of a large data set it's either not quite task you want, or there's noise in it, but it still gets you kind of in the direction that you want, and it's large, which is good. And then you have a smaller data set that's exactly the task you want, it's exactly what you want the model to do, and you very carefully collected that, and you use that kind of for the final mile of fine tuning. Okay, and so I've talked about approach where you take Bert and you download it, and you actually fine tune Bert on your labeled data. But an alternative approach to fine tuning the model would be you could just use the pre-trained embeddings from a language model to train a linear classifier. So in this case, you're not touching any of the parameters of Bert. You're just using pre-trained Bert that you download to create embeddings. And then what you're doing is just training a linear classifier to classify the embeddings for, say, the sentences whose sentiment you want to classify into the class, you know, to their sentiment or their topics or whatever. So you're not changing anything in Bert. You're just taking what it produces off the shelf, and then you use that as the input to your linear classifier. And this probably won't lead to quite as accurate performance as if you fine-tuned the language model. And it also raises the question of which embeddings to choose. So remember, we have different layers, you know, of Bert, and they contain different types of information. So which one of those do you choose? And we'll talk about that in a second. But the big advantage of this is very computationally lightweight. It's very cheap to train a linear classifier. It's pretty cheap to just do the inference to get the embeddings. And so, like, you know, you could do this on a very basic machine for very cheap. So it's pretty low cost. Jay Almar, who has the well-known illustrated transformer and illustrated Bert pages, also has a great illustration of how to do this with code that's buried on his website. And so I'm gonna like kind of use that to try to illustrate a bit more concretely how you would take this approach of just, rather than fine tuning the Bert model, just taking the embeddings from it, like not touching the Bert parameters, and then using those embeddings to train a classifier. Okay, so the classic benchmark task for sentiment analysis is classifying movie reviews as positive or negative. And if you go and you look up an example of this online, you know, they'll be classifying movie reviews. And that's the example he considers, but that's just also the example that the literature considers. So I mentioned before, there's this website called Papers with Code. I think it got bought out by Facebook AI Research recently. And essentially it compiles like all the hundreds of benchmarks that people kind of in this literature use. And it also has all the computer vision stuff too, right? Like basically all the benchmark tasks are here. And it has like a leaderboard for each one of them. And so what's the winner? And then also, you know, it doesn't just tell you the top one. If you were to click in on this, it would tell you, you know, the whole history of models used on this data set and how well all of them are doing. So you can get a really good sense of what's doing well, of course, with the caveat that your sentiment analysis is not, you know, movie reviews. And so if Roberta is like marginally better than XLNet on classifying movie reviews, does that make it better in classifying sentiment of headlines for you? You know, not necessarily. But let's just take a moment to talk about these benchmarks because you will see them in this literature. So SST2 is a binary sentiment classification from movie reviews. So basically they've taken out all the movie reviews that are somewhere in the middle, and they've taken the ones that give very bad or very positive reviews, you know, and you're classifying those. IMDb, also movie reviews. SST5 is a fine-grained classification task. And so rather than saying this is a positive or a negative review, it's like a scale of 1 to 5. People have done a lot more work with this SST2 because SST2 is part of GLUE, which is like this general kind of aggregated evaluation of how language models do. And so it's kind of gotten more attention, but you know, you can do fine-grained. And really, I think like the problem for us in doing anything fine-grained is it seems kind of subjective. Like, you know, unless you happen to have, you know, a star rating system or something, like if you're kind of reading headlines or whatever and trying to label them in a fine-grained way, that seems kind of subjective. But, you know, in principle, you can have as many classes as you have data to estimate. Yelp, binary classification, Yelp fine-grained classification. I'm not sure what MR is, Amazon reviews, and so that these are pretty much the benchmarks. So you can see this is very like kind of like corporate oriented, like, you know, how do you classify reviews of things? And these data sets are kind of like, you know, cheap to construct, because if you're trying to like predict Amazon reviews, well, you have to give it a star rating, and then you have the text, and so you automatically have your labels. But this is also relevant, and like, let's say you have a task about whether something's positive or negative, and it's not movie reviews, but you know, when people don't like a movie, maybe that has something in common with, you know, when people don't like a politician or whatever you're like trying to classify, right? And so you may be able to like take a version of the model that's already been fine-tuned, say on SST2, which you can probably just download, and then you can further fine-tune it on your much smaller labeled data set, and that's probably going to give you a better result than not doing that. So maybe even though you might say, well, I don't care about movie reviews, maybe there's just enough similarity in how people talk about things that they like or they don't like, that these benchmarks may actually come in useful for you guys. Okay, and so basically our goal is in this exercise is to use the pre-trained embeddings, and we're only going to train a linear classifier. And this task is made even more lightweight by using distill Bert, which, remember, it's a smaller version of Bert that was made by Hugging Face, which is like the, you know, kind of the by far and away dominant NLP libraries. And so you take this very lightweight Bert called distill Bert. It's already pre-trained. You want to pull the embeddings out of there. You're not going to touch any of its parameters, and then you're going to pass that to a classifier. And that is what you are going to train. Okay. So SST2 consists of these sentences, and distill Bert will be used to create embeddings for the sentences, right? So we want to use the embedding for the sequence we want to classify, right? Not for individual words. Okay. And so in order to do this, we start by sending just our sentence, our text, to the tokenizer. And we're going to start with that class token, which tells us, it tells the model we want an embedding for the text that follows that all the way up to the separator token. And you can do this kind of automatically with the tokenizer. And so you send in your text, it adds that class token, you know, it looks them up in the embedding table, it sends them through distill Bert, and at the end of that, at the top of the sort of network, there is an embedding that is produced for each one of those tokens. Okay, and so we want to ignore everything but the embedding for the class token, right? Because if you remember how we talked about how Bert was trained and stuff, that class token is producing the embedding for the sequence of text that follows it. So we don't need the word embeddings. We can throw those out. We just care about that, the output of that class token. And if we were going to fine tune Bert, you know, instead of having at the top there model number 2, which is the classifier, instead we would just directly, you know, have a training objective where we're minimizing the cross entropy loss over what comes out of that class token. And that's how we fine tune. So we can fine tune Bert to do sentiment analysis and allow all the model parameters to change, or whichever ones we don't freeze, by fine tuning the class tokens. But in this case, we're not messing with that. We're just taking Bert as is, taking its embeddings, and then using those to train a classifier. So we just need that those embeddings from the class tokens, which are kind of the sentence level embeddings in this case, since these sequences are sentences. Okay, so suppose, you know, in practice we have 2,000 reviews, and the longest sequence length is 66 tokens. Then the last hidden state that the model will produce, that it will send back to you, is a tuple that has the shape mini batch size, max number of tokens, number of hidden units. So in other words, that's a 2000 by 66 by 768 dimensional object, where 2000 is your mini batch size. So you're sending 2000 sentences into Bert. 66 is the max sequence length, And 768 is the size of embeddings in distill Bert. Like if you were using Bert large, that would be 1024. That size is going to vary. You know, if you were using Albert extra, extra large, that would be like, I don't know, like 4,000 and something, I think. So that number is going to vary depending on your model. So this is what you send these sentences into Bert, and this is what it's going to give back to you, is these tuples. And we only need the embeddings from the class token. And so you just extract those, and even showing you here the code that you would use to do that, right? You're taking the just the class token comes first. That's why that's indexed with 0. And you extract those. And then, okay, now we have the output from Bert. We have our embeddings. We're going to split those into tests and train data and train a linear classifier. And that's it, like we're done. And that was very lightweight, it didn't cost us much compute. So how well does this do? So from this blog post, this approach of using distill Bert just off the shelf on SST2, and using, as you saw here, we just took the embeddings from the final layer, that achieved 81% accuracy, which is like not really great, but you have to compare that. So if you fine-tuned distill Bert, you get an accuracy of 90.7%. So a fair amount better. If you fine-tune Bert large, you would get almost 95% accuracy. The state of the art here is if you fine-tuned T5, Albert, or Roberta, those are all kind of topping 97% accuracy. I got that off of papers with code, right? So it's kind of constantly updated. And so, you know, you could do better, I think, you know, than 81%, potentially by trying to be a bit more thoughtful about which hidden representations you're going to take. So remember, we saw this figure last class. This is from the original Bert paper. And so there's hidden representations from all the different layers. So this is using the embeddings from pre-trained Bert, not fine-tuning it, but using it downstream, I think for named entity recognition. So if you use the first layer embeddings, it's 91% accuracy. The last hidden layer is 94.9. But if you sum all 12 layers, you do a bit better. Second last hidden layer is a little bit better. You sum the last 4, that does pretty well. You concatenate the last 4, and kind of that's best. And so you kind of, if the advantage to fine tuning it is you don't have to think about this, right? You just fine tune it. But if you want to take the embeddings off the shelf, it's worth thinking about this. And so like probably, you know, for most of the tasks that we would want to do, it's hard to imagine that 81% accuracy is good enough. And also a lot of the tasks we want to do may be harder than movie reviews. So, you know, the best you could do may not be all the way up to 97%, although that's like just kind of an open question. But let's say instead you still want a cheap way to do this. And so instead of taking distill Bert, you're going to take Albert, and you have enough compute to compute the pre-trained embeddings for Albert large, and which is still going to be lighter weight than using Roberta, and you're really probably not going to use T5 on your local machine. So let's forget about that one. And so you're going to take Albert, maybe you have a slightly better computer that you're able to access or on the cloud or something, or in the lab. And so you take Albert instead of distill Bert, which is a bit more, you know, state of the art, and you pay careful attention to which hidden representations you take. And it's going to be more computationally costly, because what makes that Albert extra, extra large better is that it has much larger hidden representations and you're taking more of them. So it's a bit more costly, but it's still pretty cheap compared to fine tuning it. Then you might be able to get like, you know, 92, 93% with this method, which is a lot better than 81%. And so I still think it's like, it's potentially a viable option. If you just don't want to fine tune the model yourself, you don't have a machine that can handle fine tuning the model yourself, then this is a viable option. And this is a viable option to see if things work. It's kind of quick and easy to do this. And so maybe you want to get a quick sense of whether it works by just taking the embeddings off the shelf.